I'm Jeff Keeter. I'm the president of the George Marshall Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this latest installation of our Washington Roundtable on Science and Public Policy. That's a continuing series of the Institute that's designed to bring together the policymaking community with the scientific, technical, and economics communities to discuss issues of importance. We consider a range of topics under the auspice of that series, of which energy policy has been a long-standing focus. Today, it's my great honor to bring this panel together because it is an opportunity to talk about a product that Bill O'Keefe and I have just recently put out, which is available out on the front if you have not already picked one up. This little document that is our latest thoughts on energy policy, and in particular, it's an attempt to define a set of principles that could be helpful, we hope, to the policymaking community as they consider the choices before them in articulating energy policy visions and programs and investments. Energy's central place as an enabler of economic prosperity for the nation and for us individually is so obvious that it's often overlooked. But anyone who's ever gone a day, a night without power in their home understands acutely how important energy is to them. But our energy policy in the United States is a series of conundrums and unintended consequences as it struggles to define and reconcile diverse goals with the reality of energy's indispensability. And so our paper talks about how efforts to achieve energy independence or to pursue certain environmental objectives oftentimes run at odds with the economic and the standard of living aspirations that we've come to depend on for energy. So the piece is intended to articulate these principles, to translate those principles into policy action, and to provide, we hope, a guidepost, a framework, as it's called, for the policymaking community as they go forward. So this event today is an attempt to talk about not only those principles, which Bill will define, but also to present other perspectives on energy policy. And for that, I'm grateful that Mark Mills and Steve Yulee are here with us today to provide their own perspectives on these issues as well. So let me first introduce the panel in the order that they'll speak, and then we'll go on with the show. So leading us off today is William O'Keefe. He's the CEO of the Marshall Institute, my boss, the president of Solutions Consulting Incorporated as well. He was formerly the executive vice president and chief operating officer for the American Petroleum Institute and the chief administrative officer at the Center for Naval Analyses. He's a long-standing commentator and expert on energy policy issues. Steve Yulee is the Vice President for Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy. Previously, he was the Director of the Office of Climate Change Policy and Technology at the U.S. Department of Energy. His experiences include a decade working in various public policy positions, including the Subcommittee Staff Director on the House Science Committee and the Legislative Director for Representative Nick Smith. And then closing the discussion today is Mark Mills. He's the founder and CEO of the Digital Power Group, an energy and tech capital advisory group. He was formerly the co-founder and chief tech strategist for Digital Power Capital, a boutique venture fund where among many transactions, he served as the chairman and CEO of a lithium battery startup. He is also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, as well as a member of our board of directors, a prolific commentator on energy policy questions. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Bill?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank all of you for coming out on a snowy day to listen to us. I know all of you can read the report, so I'm not going to tell you what's in it, but I am going to comment on my 40 years of dealing with energy policy issues. I got involved in energy in 1974, so I've seen a lot of policy proposals and policy acts and presidential statements over that period of time. And for the most part, they have been based on illusions, wishful thinking, and a philosophy that prevails too much in this town. I hate to say this with all the congressional staff members here, but there's a philosophy that's like the field of dreams. If we will it, it'll happen. And it hasn't. And energy policy has been dominated by political forces that have tried to substitute for market forces. And with each of the major initiatives that's taken place, they've all had the same objective, they've all failed, and by that they meet the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Next slide, Jeff. So I'm going to give a retrospective review based on my experience. The first major energy policy act was President Nixon's Project Independence. And since then, there have been a series of them, at least 7, and they've all embodied wrong-headed policies, and those have been bipartisan. It is not the domain of either Democrats or Republicans. They both share in using illusions to advance their political agendas. Most people, especially those in the energy industry, recognize that Project Independence made absolutely no economic, environmental, or technological sense, but it has remained a major national goal, and in the process, there have been 40 years of subsidies for various types of energy or alternatives to fossil fuel. And what they've done is waste billions, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, and promote, particularly in the last decade, a growth in crony capitalism. All of this is recognized by members of Congress, presidents, but there's simply no political will to curtail them because they're beneficiaries in states and districts who need to be satisfied. The environment continues to improve in spite of rhetoric to the contrary, and I think most recently of Secretary of State Kerry's statement about climate change being a weapon of mass destruction, or the president saying that new tailpipe emissions will curtail carbon pollution and lead to changing climate change, which is having an adverse impact on the world. If any of you think that I'm engaging in hyperbole, look up work done by Ben Zeiker at the American Enterprise Institute, where he used one of the climate models and did a calculation that if the U.S. reduced its emissions by 80%, the impact on global temperatures in 2100 would be 1/10 of a degree. One of the foundations for most energy policy acts was a belief that we were running out of oil, that it was a finite resource. And if you look at that list, it goes back well over 100 years. And no matter whether the technique was a simple engineering model or a big computer model, the forecasts were always the same, that this was a finite resource and that we would soon be out of it. In fact, it became an official government policy in the 1970s that by the end of the century, we would run out of oil. At that time, worldwide proved reserves were 645 billion barrels. We have consumed since then over 1 trillion barrels, and there's about 1.5 trillion of still proven reserves. So it's not a finite resource, and Mark wrote a book called The Bottomless Barrel, and he may talk more about that. Go to the next slide. This reflects my views on the flaws of energy policy. And the first one goes back to oil. Geologists have long believed, petroleum geologists have long believed that oil was, there was an organic theory that decaying dinosaurs and plant life were the source of petroleum. I don't know how many still hold that view, but there's a shift towards organic theory of the formation of hydrocarbons, and the deep methane hydrates probably are one piece of evidence that it wasn't decaying plants and dinosaurs. But in the policy process, there's been too much emphasis placed on static conditions, where if something is enacted in law or regulation, nothing else happens. But the world's dynamic and the market system's dynamic, and as you change the system, the incentives, behaviors change. As prices of crude oil went up, there were incentives to develop new technology to find oil that wasn't economically producible 15 years ago. But in all of these acts, the one thing that has certainly happened is there's been an increase in the concentration in power in Washington, D.C. over the oil and gas industry or the energy industry and using subsidies to dictate the type of energy that ought to be produced in the future. We're enjoying a renaissance in oil and gas production, not because of anything that happened in Washington, but because of what's happening on private lands as a result of technology developed by the private sector. I think it's unfortunate that many in the private sector, businesses, have gone along with these policy initiatives because they have found it easier to earn profit through the regulatory system than in the marketplace. And I think that is a serious danger. I like to refer to it as a form of cancer. There's also, and I really don't mean to insult congressional staff members, but in Washington, in the White House, and in Congress, what I've observed is excessive arrogance. That there are people here who believe they're smart enough to manage economic activities and shape economic outcomes and to dictate what type of energy you and your children will be consuming in the decades ahead. In the 40 years, they haven't produced those alternatives in a commercially viable, scalable manner. And when you look across to see at Europe, at Germany and Spain, the other nations over there that have attempted to promote their green economy, their economies have suffered. And the citizens in Germany, I think, pay the highest electricity prices in the world, or at least the developed world. If you would like to know why I'm so cynical, I'll refer you to the 1974 Nobel acceptance speech by Friedrich Hayek that dealt with the pretense of knowledge. And a little bit of humility would go a long way in terms of improving our policy process. Next slide. As I said at the beginning, one of the reasons that these policy initiatives have failed is that there's been an effort to substitute politics and illusions for economic, energy, and technology realities. And in the end, it may increase the cost, but you simply can't repeal laws of physics or engineering or human behavior. And so fossil fuels are going to continue to dominate for at least the next 30 years. And as a friend of mine once said, the Stone Age didn't end when we ran out of stones, and the oil age will not end when we run out of oil. It'll end when technology and economics make some alternative preferable. One of the things I've advocated for a long time, I don't know that I'll live long enough to ever see it, is some provision in law and in regulations for a look-back provision. Laws get passed, they get on the book, they get encased in concrete, and no one ever goes back and says, well, what did we learn from that? And what changes ought we to make to improve what we wanted to accomplish? There's also the assumption, and it's reflected in the RFS system, of the ability to do long-term planning in energy. Of course, to do any kind of economic long-term planning is futile, but the RFS provisions set out volume and timelines and technologies that were to be used, and none of those were accomplished. And I'm reminded of a paper that the former Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, and CIA Director Jim Schlesinger wrote when he was an analyst at the RAND Corporation. He wrote a chapter in a book on defense economics that dealt with R&D planning. And he described two types of planning. One he called Cook's Tour, which is analogous to going on a vacation. If you want to go around the world, you can book your flights, you can book your hotels, everything you can book because the level of uncertainty is small. On the other hand, when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the West, he had an objective and limited knowledge of how to get there, so it was an incremental process of taking knowledge that you have, acting on it, investing in developing new knowledge, and acting on that. And I submit that our energy policy and a lot of other policies would be better served if we took small bites of things we understood, invested in new information, and then changed our direction. That may be impossible in our system, but it is a dream that I have. Have the next one. You'll find
Good to have good dreams.
better than nightmares.
Exactly.
These principles are reflected throughout the report that you have. The most important to me is the recognition that energy is an economic input. If it's abundant and reasonably priced, it contributes to job creation and economic growth. If it's made scarce and artificially too expensive, it just has the opposite effects. So we should be for abundant, affordable energy, independent of what type it is. And I'd just like to end with three realities. One I've already mentioned. Fossils are going to remain dominant for decades to come. The world will not turn away from them because there are so many people that live in abject poverty that want to improve their standards of living. They're going to do that by consuming fossil energy. The second is that we need strong R&D programs where the public sector knows what the limits are for its investment in research and technology, and it tries to collaborate with the private sector to produce outcomes that are economic and commercially viable. And the third and final one is markets work. And you can't repeal the laws of economics and market forces. They work. They work sometimes better and sometimes poorly. It depends on the underlying policies of government. Thank you.
Bill took a look at the past. I'm going to take a look at the future in a lot of my slides. I'm going to show you a lot of charts today that I think you'll find very interesting. But let's go to the first chart right away. This is a chart of proof fossil fuel reserves worldwide. And you notice there's a lot of countries in the Middle East here. Saudi Arabia's in there, Russia's in there, even China's in there. So where would the United States fall in this? This is something not too many people know. Let's go to the next slide. The United States has more proved fossil fuel reserves than any country in the world. We are an energy superpower. The problem is that we have a disco-era energy policy that is indifferent to, if not actually actively hostile to America's energy abundance. And that's something we'd like to see change. Let's go to the next slide. You've all heard about the American energy revolution that's going on today, and it couldn't come at a better time because what we're seeing is significant changes in the world. When you look at forecasts of where people think the biggest increase in energy demand is going to come from, it's not going to come from the West. It's not going to come from the developed countries. It's going to come from the developing countries, countries like China and India, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. These are areas that traditionally are not energy-producing areas, but they are getting to become big energy-consuming regions. And when you're dealing with something like crude oil or natural gas or coal, where resources are finite, or at least, excuse me, Bill, the supply the supply is tight in many of these markets. Well, the fact that we have all this energy abundance in the United States gives us a geopolitical advantage that I think we need to take advantage of. Let's go to the next slide. So, when the Chamber did produce this document, Energy Works for Us, this is our most recent policy document. I'm not going to go through all 64 recommendations in here. But when we did this document, this was really an update of a document we did back in 2008. And one of the things we had to take a look at was how has the world changed since 2008, and what are the implications for policy? And so one of the analytical tools we used to do that is to see where the Energy Information Administration, which is the statistical arm of the Department of Energy, where they were forecasting things back in 2008 when we did our original policy document, and where they're forecasting things today. So I'm less interested in where things were back in 2005 and where they are today. I'm interested in where we thought that what we thought the future would look like back then compared to what we think the future will look like today. I think this gives you a much clearer picture of really the revolution that's ongoing now in the American energy sector. So here I'm going to show you a number of slides that have two projections. A projection back from 2008, which I think in this is the red line, so that's from the Annual Energy Outlook 2008, and the blue line is the Annual Energy Outlook from EIA's most recent model run. So this would be the 2014 model run, the early release. And we'll take a look at dry natural gas production. You can see back in 2008 that we anticipated going out to 2030 that natural gas production in the U.S. would be flat. We now anticipate a significant increase in natural gas production up to close to 35 trillion cubic feet a year. That's a significant increase. And this is the shale gale that people have been talking about. Just about all this increase is coming from unconventional gas production. Let's go to the next slide. So what does this mean? What are some of the implications of this? Well, we've heard about the U.S. becoming an exporter of liquefied natural gas. Back in 2008, we anticipated that the U.S. would continue to be a large and actually an increasing importer of natural gas into the United States. That's not the case anymore. You can see from that blue line, these are net natural gas imports. So any line below zero is we become a net exporter then. The EIA now predicts that by 2017, 2018, the U.S. is going to be a net exporter of natural gas. And when you get out to 2030 or so, we're going to be a significant net exporter of natural gas. You've all heard about the LNG facilities that have to get approval from the Department of Energy. There have been 5 that have been approved, which amount to about 10% of U.S. natural gas production. But this gives you an indication of how the application of 3 technologies, hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and advanced seismic imaging, have really changed the game and reversed what was a declining picture for natural gas in the United States into one where we're now going to be a natural gas exporter. The changes that this has wrought, Mark will talk about some of the employment aspects and some of the economic aspects, but the changes this had to the economy are still being felt and will be felt for the next decade or two. Let's go over to the next slide. Okay, we did the same thing with crude oil production. Drilling for natural gas is great, but really where the money is these days is in drilling for liquids. So if you look at the red line at the bottom, that was our forecast, EIA's forecast in 2008 of where we thought crude oil production would be going out to 2030. And you can see it's essentially flat, and so we're around 2025, it starts dipping down to 2030, right? Take a look at the blue line. The blue line is what EIA now projects our crude oil production will be in the United States. And quite frankly, I think this is low. I think we could actually go much higher. They top off at about 9.5 million barrels a day. We don't think there's any reason why the U.S. couldn't produce 11 to 12 million barrels a day. And when you start producing 11 to 12 million barrels a day, you're in Saudi Arabia territory then. And you really do start having an impact on the world price of oil at that time. And just to give you an example of that, in 2012, about 700,000 barrels a day of Iranian crude oil was held from world markets because of the sanctions put on Iran. During 2012, Canada and the United States combined increased their crude oil production by about 1.1 million barrels a day. So more than enough to offset the lost Iranian oil to world crude oil markets. What that means is less volatility in markets and downward pressure on prices. So this is a very important and significant event that's going on here. Let's go to the next slide. So when we think about crude oil imports, it's been mentioned that the concern about crude oil imports has been a perennial one going back at least 40 years, certainly since the Arab oil embargo. And what this chart shows is the blue line. It shows the forecast I just showed you for domestic crude oil production. And the red line is the forecast, the current forecast for U.S. crude oil imports. And really what this amounts to by 2020, the EIA is projecting that we'll be importing about 4 million barrels a day less in crude oil than it was projecting back in 2008. So this is a significant change. It's impacting our balance of trade in ways we haven't imagined. And now we're actually having a conversation about whether to export crude oil or not. And the reason we're having that conversation, quite frankly, is because the type of crude oil that we produce in the United States is the good stuff. It's sweet and it's light. The problem is that our big refining center on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana operates on crude oil that is heavy and sour. So really what we're going to see in the next few years is a glut of sweet light crude oil in the United States. Our refineries in the Gulf Coast don't want it, And our refineries on the East and West Coast that do want it are going to be satisfied with production up to a certain point. And then the question becomes, well, what do you do with the excess? And the logical thing to do at that point is to export it. But this is going to be an educational process that's going to have to go on, I would suspect, for a number of years. But this is something that the Chamber, the American Petroleum Institute, and other organizations are involved. It's important that we educate not only the public, but the policymakers as to why exporting crude oil and natural gas is a good thing. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so we had IHS CERA do an analysis for us on some of the economic impacts. Marx will talk more about this, so I'll just touch on this very briefly. But just by 2035, we expect that the unconventional oil and gas is going to be responsible for about 3.9 million new jobs. Disposable income could be increased for the average family by about $3,500. Revenue, $1.6 trillion in additional revenue going to the government. I mean, it's probably not too far-fetched to say that fracking could be the savior of the welfare state. Investment, we're looking at $284 billion in additional investment in 2012. And we'll add 3.2% to the value of all U.S. goods and services. So this is a huge game changer. It's really the only bright spot in the U.S. economy at this point and it's all because of unconventional activity in oil and natural gas. And the benefits are spread out throughout the United States. You don't have to be an oil and gas producer to realize the benefits of the unconventional oil and gas revolution. So this chart, this map just gives you an idea of some of the states that are benefiting from this. And what's interesting, if you look at the top 10 non-producing states down here, California is one, New York is another one. They don't allow fracking in New York yet. New York is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the unconventional oil and gas revolution. I can make this available, so I think you can see the colors a little better when you get a hard copy. But the point of this is that everybody is benefiting from this, and you don't have to be an oil and gas producing state to be benefiting. It's happening across the country. Let's go to the next slide. Bill mentioned this is true. It's hard to imagine this unconventional oil and gas revolution occurring on federal land. It's all occurred on state and private land. And when you look at the forecasts, EIA is forecasting the same thing. All the increase in natural gas and crude oil is coming on state and private lands. None is coming on federal lands. What this chart just shows is that while we're having a shale gale in state and private lands, unfortunately on federal lands, oil and gas production is in the doldrums. Go to the next slide. And this is one of the reasons why. About 80% of federal lands are off-limits to oil and gas production. There's a lot of shale on the federal lands, but if you don't have access to it and you can't characterize it and you don't know what's there, then you can't produce it. And the same thing goes with our offshore areas. About 80% again are being held off limits. So if we really, really wanted to energize this revolution even further, the way to do it is by expanding access to federal onshore and offshore lands. Let's go to the next slide. So let's look at coal. EIA was projecting back in 2008 that we'd be seeing an increase in coal production. We're actually going to see, we're now projecting that we're going to see pretty much a leveling off in coal production. Two reasons for this. One is cheap gas. Cheap natural gas from shale. It's putting a lot of pressure on the coal industry, but I think even a bigger impact is the Environmental Protection Agency and the regulations that it's imposing on coal. It's not too strong to say that the EPA would like to banish king coal from the realm, and they're doing a pretty effective job of it up to this point. So we can go to the next slide. This just goes to show, this chart just shows you where some of the closures are coming from in coal facilities. We're going to be losing about 60 gigawatts. EIA now estimates it's about 10 to 20% of the entire coal fleet, which represents about 10% of all U.S. generation. This is a pretty significant hit. And I would just remind everybody, during the coal snap, everybody says, well, we can easily switch over from coal to natural gas. Natural gas is great. But there's something comforting about a utility executive looking outside the window and seeing a pile of coal, because you can't look out a window and see a pile of gas. And during the recent coal snap, one company in particular had to restart about 80% of its coal-fired power plants that it had slated for closing because of the EPA rules. Had to refire those plants to meet increased demand. Natural gas wasn't going to do it. Renewables weren't going to do it. He had to start up. They had to start up their coal-fired power plants. So the coal-fired power plants are an anchor within the grid. We feel they're completely necessary, and you can't have a modern electricity system without coal. It's as simple as that. Let's go to the next slide. And not only that, the rest of the world's not getting off coal. The International Energy Agency projects that by 2017 or so, coal is going to supplant petroleum as the largest energy source in the world. The rest of the world has no compunction about using coal. We shouldn't either. And you finish off with a couple of slides on the competitive advantage that cheap energy gives us in the United States from coal, from natural gas, and increasingly now from oil. These are natural gas prices for industry. In 2011, that's the most recent data for the International Energy Agency. And you can't see it all that well, but here's Canada and here's the U.S. here. Our natural gas prices are anywhere from 2 to 4 times lower than they are in our OECD competitor countries. Go to the next slide. And this is electricity prices for industry, also from the International Energy Agency. Same story here. You see on the left-hand side, the United States and Canada. And you can see, I don't know what's going on with Italy, very high in Italy, but for the most part, our prices are anywhere from 2 to 4 times cheaper than they are in these other OECD countries. This is a huge, huge competitive advantage, especially if you're running an energy-intensive industry. And it's no wonder that a lot of European companies are looking to either expand production capacity in the United States or build new production capacity in the United States because of the competitive advantage cheap energy gives us. And go to the next one. So energy works for us. I talked about this. You're going to hit the next slide. These are the 9 planks in our energy policy document. I won't go into any detail on any one of these, but we really have to do something about increasing access for oil and gas, coal. We have to maintain coal as part of the energy mix. We have to resolve some problems with our nuclear system. Renewables are part of the mix, but we have to make them more competitive. Energy efficiency is certainly something that we support. And we're taking a look at emerging issues like cybersecurity. A perennial issue has been getting enough students in science, technology, and engineering degrees so that we can design and build the energy systems of the future. And so these are the 9 areas that we talk about in the report in great detail. And if you give us the last slide, this is the advertisement. This is where you can go get more energy about, more information about the document, energyxxi.org. And this Better Energy Future is a fairly new coalition. We have now over 100 groups that are involved in this, and this is something that this is a group that's taking a look at the EPA regulations of greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just about coal these days. I think a lot of other industries are realizing now that they're on the EPA's list too. And so this is a coalition that we put together to make sure that business's voice is a loud one in the discussions over EPA regulations as they go forward. And with that, I will stop.
I'm slide free today, so no PowerPoint. You've seen the graphs, and I agree with my colleagues, except on one point. There are 2 bright spots in the U.S. economy. There's a lot of if you follow economic matters, I think all of us do now, by virtue of being in the longest, deepest recession in modern history. By modern history, I mean post-World War II. The Great Depression is about as relevant to today as the Revolutionary War economies were to the Great Depression. I mean, we're a long way away from that kind of structure in our world. But post-World War II is the modern economy. This is, and if you, by any measure that you would choose, we have been in recession longer than any time by a factor of more than 2. If you are doubtless experiencing this in your day-to-day lives, and everyone is at most 1 degree of separation from somebody underemployed or unemployed. So bright spots in the economy matter. The two bright spots are oil and gas, of course, and the tech sector. The tech sector is on a tear, for those of you who follow that, and not just with the release of a new iPhone or Android tablet, but because of the fundamental structural changes that are now underway in the tech sector. And as you might have guessed from my introduction from my friend Jeff, I'm basically a tech guy. I come to the energy domains through a prism of looking at technology. So let me give you a few facts to think about as they're tech-centric that are informative about the oil and gas and energy sector, and then tell you what the implications are for those things. First, let's just start out with patents. Because if you're a tech guy, the way you measure the strength of a tech company, in fact, there are ratings every year of the companies that have the most patents or the most effective patents. I have a few patents from a long time ago when I was actually doing useful work in building and inventing things. I like to think some of what I do today is useful, but I actually don't build anything anymore. If you measure issued patents, it tells you something, not patents filed. When I do due diligence, which I used to do, and do some still on acquisitions and investments in tech companies, you always look at the patent portfolio. And you don't look at what they applied for, you look at what got issued. What's issued is what matters, because you can apply for anything you want with the USPTO, but you may not get a patent. So last 5 years, just as a benchmark for you, total number of patents issued in the entire panoply of things that are considered alternative energy. By that I mean everything from wind and solar to methanol to ethanol, fuel cells, the whole schmear. I mean, that whole domain, there's been 65,000 patents issued in the United States. It's a lot of patents. So that means it's a lot of innovation, because patents are, generally speaking, fairly innovative. That is, you can't, as many patents as there are, I can attest to this from a first-hand, it's hard to get a patent because a lot of stuff's been invented. I mean, frankly, it's very difficult to get patents. So 65,000 patents issued in all the green and alternative energy, non-hydrocarbon spaces in the last 5 years or so. In the hydrocarbon space, oil, gas, and coal, you can also count how many patents have been issued in the same time period. And considering that one of them has been highly incented by both a stimulus package, by subsidies at state and federal level, and by venture money. The venture capital community in Silicon Valley deployed roughly $50 billion over a period of 5 years in green tech, yielding essentially 0% return, by the way, but a couple of notable exceptions, but they've abandoned that field. It's essentially been left, and the net deployment of venture capital into green tech is on a very steep downward slope. There's a few diehard true believers spending money there for emotional, I think, and political reasons, but not for investment reasons. So hydrocarbon domains have not had a lot of money thrown at them from the venture capital community. Some, Bill Gates among them, by the way. He is a major investor in a microseismic imaging company for subsurface imaging for oil and gas. Most people don't know that. So he's a believer. So 65,000 patents in the green and alternative energies are unrelated to hydrocarbons, and the hydrocarbon space has seen 150,000 patents issued in the same time period. I would just suggest, if you're an analyst, that would tell you something. There's some innovation going on, probably. How would you measure the effect of the innovation? Well, one would be to look at the output of oil and gas in America. That would be one measure. But there's another measure. If you're an economist or an analyst, what you would look at on any piece of equipment, if you're a business guy or gal, you'd say, how much money do I spend for my equipment to yield how much money in the product, whatever the product is. When you buy a piece of hardware in a factory or any business, it has a capital cost and a revenue yield. And these are the ultimate reductionist measures that matter. That's what, in the end, I'm a physicist, I like physics, I like tech, but in the end, it's the money that matters. The laws of physics always prevail, but they don't work so well if you don't make any money. I mean, in the business world, you need to make money. So you measure CapEx against dollar return. So you can measure this for energy things. So it turns out that technologies improved solar, photovoltaic arrays, and wind turbines rather dramatically in the last couple decades. In the last 20 years, we've seen a 200% improvement in the revenue yielded per CapEx dollar invested in building a solar array or a wind turbine. 200%. I mean, this is not the efficiency of a turbine. This is the all-in cost to build the thing and get money out. 200% gain ain't hay. And it explains, by the way, subsidies aside, why there are a lot more wind turbines in the world and more photovoltaic cells. They're more affordable. They produce more revenue per dollar CapEx. So it's 200% over 20 years. If I go to the oil and gas fields and use exactly the same metric, which is CapEx in, to drill for oil and gas and measure revenue out, We also see a 200% gain in 3 years. So that one fact, that's all you need to know to understand why there's this stunning increase in oil and gas output in America. That's the single fact that's informative, because you can make so much money so quickly. There's been such a rapid change in the efficacy of the technology. I'll give you a third sort of tech-centric fact that relates to jobs, because I think the ultimate measure is not just money, but in every economy is getting people employed, because the only way economies function ultimately is when most people are employed, earning a living that's permanent. It's not a difficult economic maxim. If you don't have most people employed, earning a living permanently, economies collapse, because you can't have a minority of people employed and a declining income supporting everybody else. This is not complicated economics. It's not even economics 101. It's painfully obvious. So let's look at employment. Let's compare the tech community to the oil and gas guys. I mean, it's the obvious place. Let's compare San Jose to Houston, for example. I mean, it's not a bad place. I mean, Houston's booming. Silicon Valley's booming, right? This is easy data. You go to the Fed, the federal data for the Federal Reserve, and you can look at total employment, not oil and gas sector employment, total employment in Silicon Valley. Because if Facebook's booming, it's not just Facebook. They don't hire everybody. You got gyms are booming, restaurants are booming, service companies are booming, health businesses boom. Everything booms around a booming catalyst. Because stimulus does work, by the way. There's nothing wrong with a stimulus. Stimulus do work. Some work better than others. I mean, that's how economics work. Every economist recognizes that you want to catalyze local and national economies by having a stimulant that causes growth everywhere. You want what I would call the ripple out effect. Something happens in Silicon Valley, it ripples out. It impacts first the valley and then the country. So Silicon Valley, San Jose, the MSA for San Jose, that whole area, has outperformed the United States in terms of job recovery by a significant amount. In that domain, when you measure employment, what's happened if you measure from 2007 to date, the change in total employment for the nation, as you all know, we're at about 98.7%. That is, we're still underwater nationally. The nation has not returned to the employment level of pre-recession. In Silicon Valley, it's at 103%. Now, in the employment statistics, a fractional percentage point change is a big deal. 3 percentage point changes is a huge deal. So Silicon Valley total employment has done extremely well. Compared to the nation, you should be unsurprised. How's Houston done? It's up 114%. Done a lot better. I'm not talking about people working in oil and gas. In the whole state of Texas, fewer than 9% of the entire population of the state of Texas is directly employed in oil and gas. This is also true in California and Silicon Valley. Only about 10% of the people in Silicon Valley are directly employed by Facebook and Google and Intel and Apple. They work in surrounding industries. Now, you can look at this at the national level, by the way. The total employment now, this is in every state of the union where oil and gas production has gone up. It's not just Houston, and not just North Dakota and Texas. All 10 states of the union where oil and gas production has increased, every single one of those 10 states, not some, have outperformed the national recovery in employment. All 10 states. Now, there's other things going on in those 10 states, like Louisiana and Colorado and Ohio, but there's a one-to-one correlation. There's no single state where that hasn't occurred. And even in direct jobs, let's look at direct employment. If you wanted a job, you came out of school, you want to work for an oil company, big oil, or do you want to work for big data? They're both booming. But who's creating more jobs directly in their domain? So one last sort of tech factoid for you. When the recession hit, the big data community, which by that I mean the information sector, which includes publishing of papers, publishing of movies, includes Google, Facebook, software, Microsoft. It includes Splunk, I wouldn't include WhatsApp because WhatsApp only has 55 people in it, even though they got bought for $16 billion. So they didn't create a lot of jobs. They created a lot of money. Wouldn't it be nice to be there? But it didn't create a lot of jobs. They created 55 jobs. Pretty high ratio if you're the investor. It's pretty nice. But if you look at the whole information sector in BLS data, what you'll find is that when the recession hit, it got whacked. It was a 10% cut in total direct employment in the information sector. It dropped 10 percentage points, and it's flatlined ever since. It's flat, has not increased. If I look at the oil and gas sector, direct employment, when the recession hit, it took a ding out of it, but it's gone up 40%. So now the oil and gas sector, broadly speaking, is directly employing almost as many people as the entire information economy. It's booming, and it's creating jobs directly in that sector. You can see it hypertrophied in North Dakota, but it's doing that everywhere. To my colleague's point, you're seeing it even in the state of New York, which has no fracking going on because of the spillover effect for the Marcellus Shale development. It's all the engineering and support services work that gets done by businesses in the adjacent state. So it's a pretty. I mean, those facts are pretty indicative. So if I'm in Washington, I'm looking for jobs. You do want to provide incentives for people who want to build tech companies, but I would suggest that if we want to get behind an existing tailwind, we ought to think hard about following some of the advice of the U.S. Chamber and my colleague Bill at the Marshall Institute, that we should get behind accelerating, not impeding, the oil and gas and coal sectors of the United States, because there's a lot of jobs being created there already. So these facts sort of point to, I'll leave you with a couple other thoughts, to a sort of a foundational problem in the policy world. Policies are anchored in paradigms. They're anchored in the way we think of the world. And as the data that you've just seen presented to you suggests, the way we should think about the energy world has been fully reversed. And that would suggest that we should reverse policies. All of the energy policies that exist in America, essentially all of them, derive directly from the 1975 Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which was anchored in a very simple set of two fundamental facts. The United States was the fastest growing consumer of energy in the world, and we had a radical decline in our ability to produce energy at that time. Never mind what the reasons were, we just weren't. So we had incredible increase in imports, a reduction in our capability to produce, and we're the biggest consumer. Imports going up, which drain our economy because they drive deficits, and demand screaming along. Totally reversed. In today's world, we're now the slowest growing consumer of energy. The fastest source of energy demand is, of course, outside of the United States. The world is going to add 2 United States worth of demand, worth of energy in the next 25 years. 2 United States worth of demand, incrementally coming outside of the United States. And we're now the fastest growing producer of energy in the world, period. No other country on the planet, none. In fact, all of them combined are not increasing their production of energy as fast as the United States, in particular North America, combined. What this would suggest is that energy policy is upside down. But just fundamentally, we've got it backwards. We did the right thing in 1975 on the face of the evidence of what was going on at that time. The world's changed. It's time to do something different. And the doing something different will drive a stunning increase in employment in America, because it will accelerate all the trends I just described, which is not instead of or despite the big data revolution. It complements it, it fuels it, it provides a capital for it. We are driving foreign direct investment into America now when we were worried about all the capital leaving America. The EIA is now tracking this. People have not generally tracked this phenomena, but we've seen $280 billion of foreign investment into America because of the revolution in oil and gas production. We've seen $100 billion in new investment in manufacturing plants, primarily chemical manufacturing plants. In the last 3 years alone, when these come online in the next 4 to 5 years, they'll add 1 million manufacturing jobs in America, which are not included in any of the forecasts from the EIA. They're not included in any forecasts from the BEA or the Census Department. No one forecasts this because it was a total black swan, if you like. A predictable black swan, I should add. I mean, I predicted it, I have to say. I get the I told you so. My book with my colleague, which was called The Bottomless Well, was not a book about oil per se. It was about technology and energy. And we believed then, and we wrote that at the time of the peak hyperbole or peak oil, that we would see the fruits of the new technologies soon, take a few years, and the United States would return to become the dominant energy supplier to the world. We have. Last point I would make for you, sort of a factoid that matters, building on the comparison between big data and big oil, is that people on the Hill frequently say to me that if we do things to provide help to the oil and gas sector, we're really just helping big oil. And nobody wants to help big oil because big oil is, big oil's evil, obviously. I mean, you watch movies where everybody knows big oil is evil. So let's just not argue whether big oil is evil or not. Let me just tell you that big oil has nothing to do with the jobs and the revolution in the energy sector in America. The oil majors did not ply the shale fields. The revolution in oil and gas production in America came almost entirely from small and mid-sized companies, 20,000 of them. Even the biggest of the miners, call them super miners, like Apache and Pioneer, they're 1/10 the size of big oil. They're all tiny companies, by big oil standards. And they are the ones that have driven this revolution. It's a very classic, dynamic American entrepreneurial story that's exactly the same as what goes on in Silicon Valley. The little companies become big, and there gets to be consolidation. That's going to start happening in oil. But right now, it's a small business revolution, just like it is in the rest of the country. The majority of people are employed by small businesses. The majority of net new job growth, 60%, according to the Small Business Administration and the Commerce Department, come from small businesses. Well, almost 100% of it in the oil and gas sector is coming from small businesses, not 60%. And it's echoing into the rest of the economy where 60% or 70% of all net new jobs come from the small businesses they create. So these shale ecosystems that exist in the United States are not because of the discovery of new oil. When you read a story, what you really generally read is somebody writes, they discovered a new oil field. They discovered the Marcellus. They discovered the Bakken. They discovered the Wolfcamp. There's lots of names to these shale fields. Well, the shale fields have been there for a long time, about 1 billion, maybe 2 billion years. The U.S. Geological Survey discovered them 100 years ago and mapped them out. This is not a discovery. Nobody drilled a hole to find them. This is a technology revolution driven primarily by information technology. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling are the secondary tools that are enabled by the ability to see where to drill and steer the drills and to manage the ecosystem that's there, all with IT. This is an IT revolution. It's actually a big data revolution. And it's generating more jobs faster than Google can, which is a wonderful thing for America. It's not the only thing America is going to be in the future. We're not going to be a resource-centric economy, but it's one hell of a stimulus and a heck of a catalyst, which we should do a lot more with. Thanks.
Gentlemen, thank you. We'll have time for some questions, but I will pose the first to you, and that is, given that we're just adjacent to Capitol Hill here, if you were to have 30 seconds with the Speaker of the House or the Minority Leader, what is the one thing you would tell them that they ought to do on energy policy?
Stop doing what you've been doing for 40 years.
Mark?
I got 1 minute with Speaker Boehner.
Sure.
I don't smoke, but I take a glass of wine. I think the single thing that could be done would be to remove the authority from the three agencies, the State Department, Commerce Department, and the Department of Energy, with respect to North American energy infrastructure. There should be no authority residing in the Department of Energy that has anything to do with whether you export natural gas. Simply, just like wheat or microprocessors, we should be able to export if you produce based on economic metrics. The Commerce Department should have no authority over the export of crude oil, which it does today, anchored in the 1938 law, should be novated. And the State Department should have zero authority over where a pipeline goes, just like there is no authority for where a highway goes or the rail line across Mexican or Canadian borders. It makes no sense. It would do more to stimulate infrastructure growth in North America, those simple three things, than any complex omnibus bill.
Steve?
I'm going to be a complete coward and say, pass our policy plan.
That's good. That's a good.
Yeah, no, I had to narrow it down a little. I'd say we know it works on private and state lands. We have to make sure it works on federal lands. That would be one. Recognize that coal has to be part of the mix. You can't run a modern economy without coal. And the third thing I would say, free trade works too, and we need free trade in energy. Not only gas, but coal and oil as well.
Questions from the floor? Sir,
I heard your remarks on what would you ask the Speaker of the House, and well, several years ago, I have come to these events here, and we often pass by this huge parking lot, looking out the windows, and I thought, why don't you come up with a new idea, like put a roof over that big parking lot, and then deploy solar cells? Have your own solar power here, and they've got it out west. Why can't we have it here? Is it too ugly, or is it too expensive? What could be wrong? They usually figure an incentive, and then let people try to order something using incentives. They can save on tax, something like that. But in many cases, it doesn't work. You've got to set the example. You've got to move. You've got to try to produce. That's how I look at it.
Ellen, over here for Peter.
Jeff, my name is Peter Husey with the Air Force Association, and thank you for doing this. I have Two questions. But I don't know how many of you saw Daryl Hannah's interview with Bill O'Reilly the other day. And the problem is she represents a very large number of people in this country. She's a very nice lady.
She is.
Dizzy, but she's talking about Keystone. Her big argument was the oil will come from Canada, will go to the Gulf, but then be exported. And O'Reilly kind of, he said, well, some of it's going to be used here. Would you gentlemen walk through what you see as you're talking about spillover and stimulus, whether it's exported or not. It's coming here at $100 a barrel, and my guess is by the time you refine it, put it through petrochemicals and make product out of it, you're talking, what, $500 a barrel equivalent? That's an enormous increase. So could you address that issue? And the other thing is, my friends Gail Lute and Annie Coren are very supportive of an open fuel standard, which we now have for all federal vehicles purchased after, I think, 2016, with some exception. I don't think the Pentagon is included. What's your view on an open fuel standard like they have in Brazil?
Keystone, so I sure confess first that I'm Canadian. And so I have a certain bias about buying Canadian oil in the United States economy. The Keystone Pipeline will displace Venezuelan heavy crude. So the first fact that the Canadians failed to adequately illuminate in the American political regime, because the trade-off there is the refineries do use heavy crude, and that's the trade-off they want to make. They'd rather take Canadian heavy crude. And you're absolutely right. Economically, it's a great swap. $100 a barrel, in fact, a little less than that. Typically, the heavy oil trades at a discount of 20% or more, so it's more like $80 a barrel, and you export it at $500 a barrel equivalent. So it's a great economic lever. The North American market, in my view, is unique because the infrastructure is mature, is the most sophisticated in the world, and the general logic behind the pipeline is not much different than the general logic behind NAFTA. There's the whole economy of North America gets lifted up, which is what Mexico is in the process of doing. They're opening up for that reason. And I agree with you. Daryl Hannah represents a constituency which I understand and respect. She's very sincere. I don't think she's not a bad person. She's not evil. I don't think she's even stupid in the sense that people would who are more deeply knowledgeable technically might. She's smart. She just doesn't know what she's talking about really. She has goals and objectives which are not bad. It's just they can't be achieved the way she wants to because she doesn't understand the facts. So when the Canadians decided to build a pipeline which would add 1 to 2% percentage points to the total existing pipeline infrastructure in North America, they thought that's a no-brainer. It's a trivial. I mean, it's not a big deal, and quite a S-storm hit them. It's become political as opposed to an economic, and this happens. It happens in politics. I don't know how it'll get resolved. I used to believe, before this past election, that the president would approve it post-election. I thought that was my guess. I thought he'd give it the unions the win, but I was wrong. He hasn't yet.
You might be interested. When I went from the UN, my first job was Senator Mike Gravel. When we went around to the Senate and said, how many of you people will support the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline? We had 16 votes. Then the oil embargo happened. The vote was 95-5. I always like to point out that one of the 5 votes was Senator Joe Biden. But that pipeline was done in, I believe, 27 months. The EPA, environmental challenges were all consolidated in one court, done with quickly. And the wellhead, the top of that pipeline, is 70 miles from ANWR, which means you could extend its life by just piping the ANWR oil over.
Absolutely.
One thing that never gets raised about this issue of, and we're importing Canadian oil just to turn around and refine it and send it out of the country, is that you can do that now with Saudi Arabian oil. And no one seems to mind the fact that we can import Saudi oil, put it into a U.S. refinery and send it out of the country. But if it's Canadian oil, for some reason this is a political challenge. I'm not quite sure what the logic is.
Bill, did you want to get in on that?
Well, part of the argument has to do with its tar sands. It's dirty, it's energy intensive, as if denying that pipeline going from Canada to the U.S. is somehow going to affect Canadian production of that oil. It simply isn't. It's going to get produced, and I've written in some of my blogs, if you think about emissions, impact on the environment, it certainly has less of an impact to send it to the U.S., refine it in state-of-the-art refineries that have the tightest environmental standards, than build a pipeline to the West Coast, put it on a tanker, send it to China, and refine it in their refineries and burn it in their cars. It has nothing to do with economics or common sense or logic. It's an ideology that is driving policy.
And by the way, this is going to become a more important issue because the U.S. has a tremendous amount of oil shale. If you look at USGS estimates, we have maybe 2 trillion barrels of oil. When you think of 2 trillion barrels of oil, that's larger than the proved reserves of the world today. And we have that in Wyoming. So we still have to be able to get to it economically and be able to process it and those sorts of things. But if that does happen and we're able to do that, then it would, the same arguments that are used against the oil sands could also be used against this domestic oil.
Lee?
Bill, to admit how old I am, I actually was on an advisory committee to the Federal Energy Administration under the Ford administration. And one of the first recommendations of that advisory committee was to get rid of the price and allocation controls that were the real source of most of the social costs associated with the oil problems in the 1970s. In fact, pretty much everything that your remarks said today have been said at least since the beginning of this problem in the 1970s, and they've been repeated. I read a book over the weekend by Peter Grossman, U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure, that paralleled your remarks perfectly. So what you're
I wish I'd written the book.
what you're saying is, I mean, there's nothing wrong with its being venerable in this case. It's a set of eternal verities, but we haven't had much success with this. What's going to change, if anything, to actually change the outcome? Or otherwise, we may be talking economic sense, but we're being a little bit like what you complained about, trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Well, it may be the analog to what Peter mentioned. It took a crisis for Congress to move faster than it's ever moved to approve the pipeline. It may take us slipping back into a deep recession or some other crisis to go to an energy policy that is based on economic and technological realities. I may not be alive for that, but I've been around as long as you. It's everybody in Congress and the White House actually know the facts, but the politics are more important because it's short run.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say that crises so far have tended to produce pernicious policies, not intelligent ones. And I fear that the institutional incentives that are built into the U.S. political system at this point, and I'm not saying that's new either, they've been there for a long time, actually, I fear, cause pernicious reactions when crises occur and actually make things worse instead of better. I don't expect you to have a solution to that, but I just, as I say, I think the question we ought to be asking ourselves is whether we can make some kind of institutional change or change the ideology, the ideological conflict in the country in a way that makes it a little less destructive than what we have.
Well, it may take a generation with the development of shale oil and gas on private lands in multiple states. If the residents in those states see that they benefit, that may be a form of grassroots action that will permeate the national level.
Well, I'd say we already have an energy policy, which is not given the realities of Washington, it's not so bad. The energy policy on federal lands, BLM land, is, I think your data showed, is down. So we have a federal energy policy, which is to reduce production of the fuels that the world uses the most. And we have, on state and private lands, a stunning growth and increase using new technologies with small businesses that have generated wealth in those states and jobs. And so there's two different policies. They're both in play. And America is fortunate enough that we've got enough land and people that we can try the experiment. Maybe one of the jobs is, to your point, Bill, is the people will begin to notice there's a difference. So states that are BLM land dominated, whether it's offshore or onshore, or state dominated like Governor Cuomo, have begun to notice that their job recovery is in the bottom quintile, and the other 10 or 12 states are the top quintile. And it's not because that they have tax structures that are more favorable by and large. They're producing.
Well,
I think I think we need a complete change of mentality for that to happen. As I mentioned in my talk, we are the animating philosophy behind our energy policy has been one of scarcity. When you think of how the U.S. Impacts global energy markets, it's usually been on the demand side, not on the supply side.
Yep.
That's changing, and so I think what needs to change is the attitude that policy shouldn't be animated by scarcity. It should be animated by abundance, and we should be having offense. We should be playing offense instead of playing defense on energy policy. And I think if people think in terms of offense, we can be a player on world markets. We can have influence in world markets. We may not be able to price makers, but we're not necessarily going to be price takers either. If policymakers are comfortable with that shift, then I think we would see a more aggressive energy policy. But I don't think it's going to happen until that shift comes about.
Steve, that's well said. And Lee, I'd just add that the constituencies and constituent interests drive the Congress as much as any other variable that one could point to in the long history of American political science would show you that. So as the facts that Mark and Steve have laid out take hold and become more well appreciated and recognized, I think maybe we'll begin to see the movements that we're all so hopeful for. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and the three panelists for joining us. We'll certainly have time for questions and such after we break, but I do know that the afternoon is getting on us, and I want to allow you to get back to your jobs. Thank you so much.